With recordings in progress.
Sorry, Andrew.
Thank you very much indeed for parting with hard-earned cash to listen to us talk. I hope we do it justice. I'd just like to start by saying the reason that Sykes and Artichoke work together and have for so long is that both our companies take our responsibilities towards the precious raw material that is wood really very seriously. Bob, whose timber yard you can see here, provides us with really wonderful timbers that have taken centuries to grow, and we turn those into rooms which will be there for centuries. So it's a very symbiotic relationship. Unlike many, Artichoke has chosen to stick with using solid hardwoods wherever we possibly can in projects, which is the difficult route to take, really. Solids are a very different ball game to veneers. They're much more technical because solid wood moves, but we favour it because we're both, Bob and I, are interested in sustainability through longevity and by making rooms which will form a long-term part of our architectural heritage for centuries. Oops, I'm just trying to move on to the next slide, which isn't moving on. Dana.
Oh dear.
Oh, there we go. I've got it. So, okay. So the purpose of the talk this evening is really to discuss the typical hard and softwoods used in English country houses, touch on their merits, their faults, their availability, and also look at alternatives perhaps to those now scarce. And the timbers we're going to touch on are English oak, Russian deal, elm, chestnut, European walnut, mahogany, poplar, and beech, and anything else anyone wants to discuss at the end. So various timber species were used for the construction in medieval England, but the king to many is English oak. English oak is rot resistant, which makes it ideal for exterior joinery and boat building. In fact, many Queen Anne houses and early Georgian country houses feature repurposed oak beams that at one point were part of a naval ship. This particular image is one of the exterior doors at Heel House in Wiltshire, which some of you may be familiar with, which we visited recently. There's really no need to finish oak, in my personal opinion. You can, if it's left unfinished, it takes on this really wonderful colour and character. You can get away with oiling it for interior use, but if you spray it, it tends to go orange. We've developed our own finish for interior oak to keep it as natural as possible. Of course, much of Britain's ancient forests are either now protected or gone, which makes buying oak for large country house projects really quite challenging. While English oak is often lauded as the king among joinery timbers, it's actually a real pain to use, particularly at scale, which is how we as a company use timber. English oak grows slowly because of our climate, with the main trunk before the first bough being really quite short and stunted, and it's also darker in colour than French oak, and it tends to be wilder grained and knottier with faults and shakes throughout the trunk, which many rustic cabinet makers like for character, but it can make some rooms look quite agricultural if used en masse, such as in panelling and indoors. Much of the English oak available in the UK today is either on available sort of farm grown or estate grown, as opposed to being from managed forests as it is in France and Eastern Europe. So unless you know a friendly farmer or earl, really the best English oak trees are often really quite scarce. And if any of you guys listening or us was to design a large library or panelled room, it would be nigh on impossible, I think, to find enough English oak that had grown in the same stand. The issue of stand is quite important. What I mean by a stand is trees which grow in the same stand in the same wood. They generally suck up the same minerals and consequently share the same colour grade, giving you consistency around the room. Is there anything you want to add to that, Bob?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you everyone for joining and giving us the opportunity to chat.
Yeah, I mean, oak, Andy's absolutely right. English oak is stronger in character, gnarlier, beautiful in its own right for the right use, but not as mellow as oak from sort of across Europe. I mean, generally in oak, people consider, the sort of mildness of oak to change as you sweep down the UK into Central Europe and across to Eastern Europe. Oak tends to get milder and mellower the further across you go. So it's trying to find that sort of optimum point where the best quality wood is, availability of wood, and the texture of wood is right. And we tend to plump for French oak, and we buy our French oak primarily off one mill just north of Dijon. And we do that because they're a small sawmill, a family sawmill who understand quality, understand the importance of consistency, and all the things that companies like Artichoke seek. Consistent wood each time is the reason we go to these people. So that's good, mild, mellow oak, ideal for high quality joinery and cabinet making.
So not controlling provenance can mean you can end up with a room of poorly graded oak, and the reason I'm showing you this picture of this dreadful cabinet is because it's a really good example of a piece that's been constructed with really no consideration to grain, quality or color. And if you can imagine this was replicated across a room of paneling, then you essentially would probably end up with a room that would look like a patchwork quilt. And the only way you'd come over that is really, I suppose, is through heavy staining and discoloration. These are some display cabinets that we designed in a project with Adam and with Todd Hunter-Earl. And they're all identical cabinets essentially. So it's really important to make sure that the timber that Bob's supplying us with is all as consistent as it possibly can be. Bob, do you just want to explain this particular slide, because it sort of helps explain the different cuts of timber and how they might affect the purchase?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a very sort of topical subject at the moment. The look people want from timber, particularly oak. Traditionally, the most stable timber and the most sought after traditionally was the quarter-sawn oak. So the one on the right-hand side. That quarter-sawn oak is the most stable, and logs can be cut to quarter-sawn as shown by that graphic, which is a very expensive way to cut a log to get the most yield out of it. But provides, the highest quality wood, and we will all know it with seeing the silver fleck with the medullary ray that goes through the board. So you see that silver fleck running, very attractive, but these days not very sought after. The other extreme of that is cut through and through, is the graphic on the left-hand side. So that's giving wood that will be both flat sawn, rift-sawn and quarter-sawn, and that's the traditional way of cutting timber. So you can select from a log cut like that specific pieces where you want to use them in specific locations. The middle graphic is rift-sawn. Rift-sawn gives the straight grain without the medullary ray. So it's just the medullary actually follows the grain. So it's just like pencil grain, they call it. That is very stable wood, but very expensive to produce. It's very wasteful to cut from the log, and therefore very expensive to buy. Rift grain has been very popular in recent times for one reason or the other. The look, the sort of consistent lines is attractive, but very difficult. And really one has to think when specifying wood, the look they're going for, meeting sort of stability with the aesthetic, if you like. So we talk to customers a lot about what they're trying to achieve. Do they want to see grain? Do they want to see fleck? Where is the wood being used? All that's so absolutely vital in timber specification.
So this is a good image. It shows the difference between French and English oak. So on the left we have a beautiful clean board of French oak, and then on the right a sort of typical board of English oak, which from a cabinet maker's point of view is quite awkward to pick through all those knots unless you're looking for something that is a sort of generally quite a kind of rustic product. So I'm now going to move on to Russian deal. In the 17th century, the consumption of English oak for housing and fuel and naval shipbuilding placed massive demands on native timbers like oak, English oak. And this was further compounded by Britain's incoherent reforestation policy, in so much that there wasn't one. The British Navy also had first refusal on all the best oak. And by the end of the 1600s, these internal supply issues really had influenced the shift from English oak as the most commonly used constructional timber to softwood, which I think still has quite an unnecessarily bad rap these days. Softwood dries much more quickly than oak, and it reduces its weight and helps to keep it very stable. So in the early Georgian construction period, teams started looking further afield, and in fact towards the Baltic, where there were huge tracts of virgin conifer forest easily accessible, principally from Archangel and Onega. And these trees had never been harvested before. They were very, very tall, had very, very few branches low down, and they were really excellent. So because they were growing in a cold northern climate with short summers and long winters, the growth rings were very tight. The timber was very dense and harder than our homegrown softwoods, which grew more quickly, and they became very, very popular. And as a consequence, Russian deal became really the workhorse of building in English country houses, both for structural work and also architectural joinery. English oak was kept for ship's hulls and decoration in the most. So if you're involved in the renovation of a Georgian house, it's quite likely that the architectural joinery that's there will have been made from Russian deal. It also has a benefit which isn't so prevalent these days, that it was disliked by death watch beetle, which oak was loved by death watch beetle. It's very challenging these days to buy Russian deal from Russia, not because it's scarce, but because these huge, large Russian timber yards aren't really commercially interested in selling small companies like Artichoke small volumes of high quality boards. And you can imagine negotiating with the foreman of this particular yard that you want a few nice boards for your library. You'll get a pretty short shrift, I suspect. Do you want to expand on deal, Bob?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely right. Russian deal was the sort of the highest quality, close grain. You could see in that previous picture, that skirting, nice tight growth rings which aid stability, and it really was the sort of the king of the softwoods in red deal, Russian red deal. Again, and he's absolutely right. Buying it now from Russia is impossible unless you want to buy literally a boatload and take mixed grades, and a much harder thing to sort through. When you're really only looking for the top end of material. So with Russian redwood becoming not available, we needed to switch to where we could buy high quality redwood, and where that's ended up for us, and we believe firmly the best redwood still available, is in sort of the mid region of Sweden, where the trees are reasonably slow grown, the growth rings are tight, and the wood is very, very clean of knot, much like the Russian redwood. If you go further up in Sweden, which is tighter growth ring material, it does suffer from black knot. You get these little black knots all over it, which again aren't suitable for appearance joinery. So we aim for mid-Sweden, good clean material, slow grown, and it's the closest we can get to Russian redwood. We're not as good as Russian redwood, but the closest that's still commercially available to buy. So that's where we source the redwood.
One of the great benefits of using timbers like larch and redwood for cabinet making is that it has a slightly pronounced grain, and this is a downstairs kitchen we designed made from larch. which 150 years ago, a room like this would have been made from Russian deal or perhaps estate-grown softwood. And from an interior design point of view, from an appearance point of view, by dispensing with a paint primer and sealing the wood with a thin concoction that we make up, and then thinning down the top coat, you can get the grain to grin through the paint, which is the same really for oak. It's very expensive to overpaint onto oak. Some do, but from an appearance point of view, sometimes it's very nice to see the grain grinning through paint, which you don't get with more sort of a flatter, coarse, tighter grain timbers like poplar, which we'll talk about. In this particular project, we painted over the hinges as well, to make it feel like it had been around for a while. So these are the sort of timbers that Bob would supply these days instead of Russian deal, redwood on the left and Siberian larch on the right. And you know, if anyone's got any questions at all on any of these specifications, I'll flash Bob's email address up at the end, and he'd be an excellent guy to question about any of these things. Like oak, elm is white elm rather is known for its rot resistant qualities, and it was excellent for exterior work and was used a lot. It's one of the largest deciduous trees in England. It was commonly used as a building material for roof frames and supporting beams, and it's incredibly strong. It could withstand immense crushing forces, but it was not as popular as English oak because it tends to move and split. And this is the reason that quite often the smaller English country house or farmhouse tended to favour English elm. In the smaller house, cost was obviously a factor, and builders could get more out of a larger trunk. This particular image in my own house, complete with decorative cobweb, shows that this particular beam has been aged at 1175, and as you can see, it's contorted and twisted and has a fairly rudimentary agricultural armwork remedial to ensure that it hopefully doesn't split further, which I hope it doesn't, because it's about a metre or so above my head. As many as you will know, for the older ones perhaps, Dutch elm disease ravaged the UK's population of English elm between the 70s and 1990. And there are now very few left, making English white elm pretty exclusive. The remaining English stock tends to be quite gnarled and rustic in appearance, so like English oak, needs to be selected quite carefully. What would you do, Bob, if you wanted to make a project from elm?
Well, elm, if you're looking on the sort of joinery element, again, you'd be looking at European elm for this sort of milder, straighter grained timber. I mean, English elm, Scottish elm, which there's more of actually, but is beautiful, probably prettier, more grain, much more interesting. But if you're looking for joinery specifications, then yeah, European elm. All elm needs care. All elm needs a lot of thought about how it's specified. As you rightly said, the stability, you've got to be very careful with elm, even European elm. But it's a beautiful, beautiful timber, and used in the right places, it's just a fantastic product, but a lot of care needed in specification of it.
This image shows again the difference between the sort of European elms growing beautifully straight and true, and then the slightly scruffier English elm on the right, which actually is beautiful, as Bob said, but it depends on the project really. Chestnut has a slightly poor rap in many ways. It was known as the poor man's oak, and still is in some cases. It's a very common tree. You'll all have seen them in parklands and woodlands. They grow very tall, they're very strong. They were used a lot for floorboards because of their length, and the grain is actually very similar to oak, and at one point was quite a lot cheaper than oak, but it's not as strong as oak or elm, so it wasn't really ever used structurally. It did go out of circulation and popularity when it became the same price as oak. I think it's still, is that right now, Bob, about the same price as oak?
It's not a million miles away, no, it's close.
But it was used a lot for sort of internal decorative use, particularly for grander country houses. It's a really excellent bet, and I think it takes being aged and distressed brilliantly. So if you've got a project that requires some character to it, elm is, I think, a really excellent choice. It's more durable and stable than oak, as I said, it doesn't come in quite the same widths as oak, so floorboards, it's brilliant for floorboards. What about procuring that, Bob?
Chestnut, well, you're absolutely right. Again, I mean, it was considered, as said, poor man's oak. I mean, it was often used for fencing, agricultural fencing, chestnut paling fencing, probably most people have seen, and therefore, by association, it was always sort of deemed a sort of constructional agricultural product, not one you'd use for your own home type of thing. But actually, the wood is beautiful. You rightly say, again, it is more durable and stable than oak. And so it is a great resource. The other thing that's very popular these days, I touched on earlier with oak and how people didn't want to see medullary rays but wanted straight grain. Well, chestnut is a timber that produces, as this image shows, actually produces straight grain without the fleck of medullary ray. So if you like that nice clean look without the oak type look, but without the fleck, using straight grain chestnut is probably a better specification than trying to use Rift-Sawn oak. So yeah, a great timber, more limited in supply than oak. So again, needs careful specification, but yeah, a really good homegrown option.
Thank you, Bob. This is just a quick photo of a cabinet that we made in Chestnut for a project in the Isle of Wight, which has small sections in it, so it's difficult to pick it out, but it's a really lovely wood. I've bought European walnut and mahogany together because their history in the heritage of English country houses is quite closely aligned. Originally, it was native to Asia and Greece, and it was introduced to Britain in the 1400s, with most supplies coming from France, again because of the climate. It grew truer and much more rapidly. And until the early 1700s, European walnut was by far the most popular of the decorative hardwoods used in English country houses. It's got a really beautiful soft color and a really lovely grain. But access to walnut was sort of ceased rapidly in 1709 when the Great Frost happened, when the harshest European winter for 500 or so years killed off much of the walnut stock in France, which triggered English cabinet makers to look elsewhere for alternatives. Fortuitously, we were pillaging the rest of the world at the time. So in 1721, the British Parliament removed all import duties from timbers imported into Britain from the British colonies, stimulating the growth in West Indian timbers, including mahogany, most importantly. And with no competition from walnut, mahogany in England just went nuts, rising from a sort of 520 tons a year in 1740 to 30,000 tons 30 years later. And in a relatively short period of time, mahogany became the most popular timber for high-end luxury furniture and architectural joinery in the country houses of England. Brazilian and West Indian mahogany is, of course, no longer imported from the Americas, although Bob probably has underground contacts of old mahogany if you need it. And the only true mahogany imported really these days is African mahogany, which is lighter in color than Brazilian, and tends to have a slightly wilder grain to it. But between the two, our timber of choice would always be European walnut, for its softer colouring and its really beautiful grain. And these two images show the sort of flexibility of the material. The image on the left shows an architrave and door and then leading to a vestibule all in European walnut, which have been sort of stained down to a sort of darker color. And then moving through those glass doors, we stripped out the color of and bleached the walnut, and then reintroduced color back in to give it a kind of slightly sun bleached appearance. And if you look on the image on the right, you can see that the really beautiful grain of the walnut still showing. Here are obviously a pair of doors that are treated in very much the same way. So if you're working in a project that does call for mahogany, or you're looking for a kind of mahogany look, it would be well worth steering the client towards your European walnut. We think it's a really beautifully elegant wood. It has quite a lot of wastage in it just by proxy of how it grows. One thing I would say is that we see a lot of designers using the term walnut generically on projects. This can cause quite a lot of confusion, as some may allow for American black walnut, which was quite popular a few years ago, and that has a completely different look altogether. It's kind of beige as a timber, and the quality of American walnut coming out of America is much poorer quality these days, and it does tend to go a kind of yellow creamy color, I think, when it's particularly when it's in well lit rooms.
I think if I can, American black walnut has got quite an association really with it's a more sort of commercially available product. I mean, again, one tends to think of things like sort of a lot of banks were fitted out in American black walnut, or building societies, and one has that perception of a veneered board. American black walnut is a classic look, where European walnut is a truly beautiful, unique timber, and gives that the work that Artichoke have done in it, and we've been fortunate to supply the wood, but it is quite classical and beautiful looking. And I think that replication of true architectural joinery that will stand the test of time, European walnut is just a go-to choice. It's a beautiful timber. Again, Andy's right, and I say it about every wood because I'm a timber merchant, but it does need close specification and needs thought. It's a small tree, doesn't grow in big sizes, needs thought how it's how it's specified. But a fantastic choice that takes a project out of the norm, takes it out of the realm of what most people are doing, and I think that's a beautiful choice.
So this is an image of one of those boards actually used in the previous project in its processing stage. And as you can see, you've got the sort of central heartwood and then the pale heartwood flanking that. So the sort of core grain runs straight through the center of the board. It looks very black and white. It does oxidize. It takes a few weeks to oxidize, but it does end up being roughly the same color eventually, with a very thin sapwood at the side.
It is actually a very common thing with people seeing walnut and thinking that the pale bits are just sap. They're not. The core of a walnut tree, the chocolate core, is often very small, as this log shows. Again, the important bit is to get consistency of wood, and for that reason, again, all our walnut at the moment comes from a mill in Macedonia, where it's traditionally grown, and again, it helps in consistency of color, texture, and everything. And walnut obviously grows throughout Europe and right into sort of Afghanistan, right across Pakistan, Afghanistan. So it's available in a lot of countries, but again, to get the right wood to do these sort of projects, one has to sort of focus on a particular area.
Should we send you off to Afghanistan, Bob, to get some walnut for us?
I'll think about it. I'll come back to you on that one.
Poplar is a timber that many of you will be familiar with, and in the English country house, it was kind of at the bottom of the food chain, really, typically used as sort of carcassing and firewood. It's very easy to mess up the specification of poplar. European poplar and North American poplar are actually entirely different species altogether. And it's very, very easy to get it wrong. And if you do get it wrong, it can be disastrous if it's not specified correctly. Bob, anything to add on that?
Yeah, well, again, poplar is a big subject, even in North America, where the poplar we're using in kitchens and general joinery these days is North American poplar. Again, that varies hugely from where you're buying it in America. The southern states is fast grown, very open grained, lightweight, fluffy material. You go further north to the sort of lakes, you're sort of a closer grain, bigger trees, much slower growing, tighter growth rings, giving much more stable, firmer timber. So again, it can't even, European poplar is something that shouldn't be touched in a joinery sense. American poplar needs thought, whether you're buying it from North or South America, because they're it's a long way apart. They're chalk and cheese. They're almost like different woods. So that's an important thing in specification of poplar.
So it's probably worth, if you have got a big project on and you want to make sure that it's being bought correctly, that is to specify, what would you say, Appalachian poplar, Bob, as a sort of
Appalachian's the start of it. I would term it as the northern USA poplar. It should be coming from sort of Michigan, Illinois, that sort of, right up by the lakes, basically. That's where the best poplar grows.
This is poplar. Many of you will be familiar with it. It's not a wildly attractive timber, untreated, but it does take paint beautifully. You won't get any grain grinning through it because it's got such a tight grain, but it's a very stable timber. It's excellent for painted work. Beech, I think this is the last timber on the list. It's not a timber that really gets used that often. It's very rarely used in joinery these days, for a very good reason. It takes on the huge amounts of moisture in comparison to other timbers. And if you were to make a door from beech, it's very likely that it would swell during the more humid months beyond the opening of the door, of the door opening. So you wouldn't. It would be problematic, which is why it's kept principally to items of freestanding furniture and plywood and wooden spoons. So, I mean, in conclusion of the talk element of this tag talk, joinery projects, they can be massively improved by precise specification of both species and provenance. It is a bit of a minefield, and if you've got any questions, and Bob is, as you've heard, an excellent knowledge base on the correct specification of timbers, and we'd obviously be very happy to discuss it with you. Questions?
Great, thank you so much, Andrew and Bob. That was super informative and really useful for me as an architect, and I'm sure for many others as well. I'll kick off with a question of my own while we wait for a few more questions to come through. I wanted to ask you about the tradition of processing timber and manufacturing joinery. Have you seen, obviously a tradition can be a live tradition, as in it's constantly kind of reinventing itself or being influenced by current times. Have you seen any changes over the course of your career in the processing of timber and the manufacture of joinery, in making it more efficient, or has technology played a role at all? Just curious.
Shall I start on the timber side of the raw material? Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's become a sort of, as things have progressed, timber production has become much more efficient, much less wasteful. Obviously, it's a very valuable raw material. It's our only true sustainable material, and people that have sort of started to understand that and understand the importance of looking after it. And this all comes down to specification further down the line, but from procurement to specification to end user, it's got to be a flowing process. So yeah, I'd say technologies, saws are getting better yields out of the timber. People are thinking where the timber might be used. So rather than just all being used for joinery, they're using every part of the tree, from the class joinery woods to some carcassing wood on the outside of the log to firewood, obviously, from the fallers. So we can generally say the people we deal with, the mills we deal with, what we do at our own facility is utilizing the whole of the tree to its maximum and making sure that something that's taken a long time to grow gets used properly, rightly properly, and then goes on to for projects that Artichoke and the like produce and will be there for centuries to come.
Yeah, I mean, certainly from a furniture making point of view, our trade really hasn't. We're still using the same tools, as you can see in the picture, but we do use modern technology to help us get a lot more out of boards than previously we would have been done by hand. And modern CNC equipment and machinery it reduces mistakes. It means you can be a lot more efficient with what you get out of a board. So there's a lot more respect by proxy of this technology, and it does mean a lot less offcuts than there would have been 20 years ago or so.
Great, thanks so much. We've had many questions now, so I'll start with Robert. If you could unmute yourself and we can hear your question. If he's there, Robert?
Yeah.
There you are. You asked one question in the beginning, yeah.
Yes, it was the appearance of the quarter sawn, the plain sawn and everything. I'm not quite sure about what the difference visually is on the way the timber is cut.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you had any images of that to show what that looks like.
Well, I mean, I can describe it. I can't produce something from my little. But
you also mentioned a medallion raised, straight grain, and fleck. I think maybe that's how you were trying to describe the visual.
Yeah.
character.
So what we call with a flat sawn board. So the grain, if you look at the end of the board, the grain is running horizontally to the end of the board.
Okay.
So that gives a flat sawn board, and that gives what we traditionally term as cathedral grain. So conical grain running down the board.
Okay.
So a traditional piece of wood seeing the grain. The quarter sawn, so the grain is running at 90 degrees to the end of the board as you look at it, so vertically. And that means that the medullary rays within the log are being sliced through. So they're little rays of sort of silver that run along the grain that they slice through and give that fleck look. So you have a straight grain and little silver flecks across the board. So that's the quarter sawn board.
Okay. Okay.
Does that make more sense?
Yeah, I'm getting a view. I'm getting a picture of it now. I'll check it out later.
It sort of looks like a tiger's stripe in many ways.
All right. Okay.
And when you look at kind of sort of early Georgian paneling, you will often see this kind of fleck running horizontally across the grain,
Okay.
which some cabinet makers really love. But it does make things look a little bit rustic.
Yeah.
If you're looking for that look, then it's great. It's great to have.
Okay, and I just had one other quick question in terms of sustainability. I guess a lot of these trees take a long time to grow, so we need to be aware of sustainability and justifying this. So can you help us with some response to how we can justify using solid timber on a project when we could just use veneered MDF or something? Yeah. In terms of sustainability.
Can I start that one again, please, Andy? If I may. Yeah, I mean, it's a perfectly sensible question, and again, it should be considered like everything every time we look at anything. I mean, our view on it, as I said earlier, timber is the only naturally sustainable material we have that can be replaced within a sensible time period, dependent on the species you use. I mean, ironically, tropical trees grow a lot quicker and easier and replant quicker. But the idea of using timber properly, specifying it properly, and then, as we touched on earlier, being used in design properly, and then having the longevity in service, if you like.
Mhm.
That's how we justify the fact using hardwood properly will mean that hardwood table, desk, door made properly will be there in 300 years time, you know.
Yeah,
And
okay.
that's and there'll be 3 lots of trees grown when
Mhm.
that's had its day. And I think that's and also obviously veneered board is liable to damage, which often happens, and it can't be repaired in the same way as solid can. So in lots of ways,
That's two good points. Yeah.
yeah, I mean that yeah, everyone has, and it depends on what project you're looking at, what your lifespan you're expecting out of it, and the rest of it, obviously. But
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. Good, thanks.
We've got a question from Clooney, who just messaged me directly. Do you want to come forward and ask your question?
Oh, hey. I was wondering how much the difference in different species of oak or different species of lime has an effect on the timber quality in the end, because you don't often see them. Well, I have never seen them specified, the kind of different types within a particular timber, but I guess there must be quite noticeable differences, but I'd be interested to hear about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, oak particularly. I mean, there's loads of subspecies of oak. As it is, you know, as in the timber market, really only 2 subspecies of oak would come to market for joinery and cabinet making. So it's funny, in all the years I've been doing it, it's not something I've ever had to worry about. We're aware of other subspecies that you wouldn't touch, but a sawmill producing for a joinery market isn't even going to consider those trees.
Okay. Thank you very much.
But it's a good question. Yeah.
I've got a question from Mark, our chairman.
Oh, hello. What an introduction. So talking about, I've got two questions, but the first one is very brief, just taking off from the last. The difference between horse chestnut and sweet chestnut. I say that because I associate sweet chestnut with a lot of extremely good, very strong structural timber used in Italy and other places, backed by, by the Romans and so on. So I just wondered if any comments on that.
Yeah, absolutely right. You wouldn't touch horse chestnut to do any joinery out of. No, I mean, it's sweet chestnut or Spanish chestnut, as it's also known, fine timber. The horse chestnut, not suitable again at all for any joinery type work. Not used in the field at all.
Right. Okay, that clears that one up. And the other one is just arose out of an exhibition that's on at the moment, which anyone who's within striking distance of Bonhams, Bond Street, you can get to see this free exhibition as long as you go before closes at 4:30. And I think it closes at the end of this month on Grinling Gibbons, that very wonderful carver, you know, around the time of Christopher Wren and so on. And there the emphasis is on the sort of carvability and the stability of the wood in terms of what detail it can take. And you know, lime wood seems to have been the most popular then. I just, you know, wondered in terms of the kind of things you've been talking about, and the images you've shown, often you've had doors and so on, and paneling. But if you had to have say carved work with some detail, would you advise people to go over to lime wood, or would you actually say, actually, there's very good timbers among the ones you've dealt with that would be good for that purpose as well?
Well, again, I'm sorry, Andy, if I'm
you carry on, Bob, you know it all.
No, I would certainly go over to lime. I mean, again, you've got to be careful of where the lime's grown, like anything, you know, where it's from. You know, it wants to be slow grown, tight growth rings, but lime is the king of woods for carving. The only other woods that would come near it is a sort of fantastic old Brazilian mahogany type thing, but that's no longer an option. So lime is the go-to wood for high class carving, certainly. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thanks. Next, we have a question from James McIntosh. Actually, a few.
Yes, I've got 2 questions. Thank you very much. So the first question is about floorboards. For years, we've been specifying repairs and replacement of sort of oak floorboards in 18th century country houses. And we developed a specification that was sort of 80% Rift-Sawn, so quite a straight grain through and through cut, and 20% quarter sawn. And we've been using that for a long time, and that was looking really good. And in the last 5 years, everyone has said, you know, sustainability, we simply can't produce that anymore. So my first question is, what can we do to get a really good, authentic looking sort of 18th century Georgian floorboard? The second question is quite different. It's about moisture control really on site. We've had a project recently in Plymouth where we were specifying doors to match sort of early 17th century doors that were only ledged and not braced, and they warped quite significantly. And a similar project in Northamptonshire on a hotel where we specified doors and they shrunk quite considerably. We don't have the same problems where we're nominating joiners to do the work. It seems to be projects where we have a main contractor that we have very little control over. There's probably not enough control of humidity on site, and I wondered really what we should be saying in specifications to make sure that we're covered, and ultimately we're not rejecting joinery that should be perfectly good anyway. So two quite different questions really, but I'd be grateful for your thoughts.
And handle the first, Bob.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a very, very good question, and it's sort of relevant to obviously what we discussed briefly during the presentation. Yeah, I think, you know, to be perfectly frank about it, that specification isn't going to happen anymore. Sensibly, I mean, it could be done, but as a cost basis to do it, not really feasible anymore. I mean, when we do get people wanting prevalence of sort of Rift-Sawn and quarter sawn, obviously from Rift-Sawn to quarter sawn, you're starting from any grain orientation of sort of 45 degrees or 60 degrees and upwards. The only way really to do it these days is to buy full oak bulls and utilize the parts where you want it. But the difficulty with that, you will also always have some crown cut boards left over, basically. So if you haven't got a place to utilize that material, for instance, Artichoke now buying oak, buy the bull and use the right bits in the right place. And that is the most economical and sort of logical way of doing it. But you have to have a use for the other parts. So I don't know whether that's something you can do, but yeah, other than that, it's say logs can be cut to rift, but it's, buying oak is difficult now, full stop. Buying very good oak's difficult now, full stop. Then to ask for rift cut, you probably get pretty short shrift from sawmillers.
On the humidity and movement question, it's not surprising actually that the joinery doors that you've had made by cabinet makers seem to perform and the ones by builders don't. Most cabinet makers would bring probably the joinery, the logs or the boards that they're using. They would acclimatize it in their own workshops. They might plane off sections of it, leave it again to acclimatize further. It's about treating it very, very gently. And then what they might do is bring the doors once made to site, oversize to acclimatize further before then sizing them up on site. And obviously that requires a fairly dedicated series of processes, which a lot of builders don't have. They don't have the place to store them, and so on and so forth. So the reason that the doors are moving is because they're shocked and taken from one perhaps dry environment to a more humid one, or vice versa. and solid wood, as you know, moves, and it's obviously proven in your case. And the builders really, I suppose, need to be asked to acclimatise the timber before fitting the doors.
I think just to add to that briefly as well, that it's very common in our experience that this sort of contractor will go on the price route, whether that's the timber procurement or whatever, will go on the price route. Poor quality timber with the best will in the world moves. It's got to be consideration. And while the cabinet maker joiner tend to understand, care, and think about it more, and realize that the timber element, you've got to spend money on timber to save money on what you're producing. They realize it's a smallish element of the job, and it's got to be specified and bought from the right sources. And it's we see it often with contractors, exactly that.
Great, thanks. I'm going to move on to the next question because I'm conscious of time. Eve, do you want to come on and ask your question?
Hi, I just wanted to ask you, we're talking about English oak and that it has rot resistance. I just want to see what are your opinion on other types of oak, and do they have any similar resistance?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. They all have the resistance to rot. I mean, they are naturally durable. English oak, I mean, obviously there's plenty of examples of English oak throughout the country, and in Tudor buildings and all sorts of construction, which it's ironic in these times when we're offering people guarantees on sort of chemically modified timbers, that we have natural timbers that have sat the test of time for 500 years. it's just a sort of gimme, if you like. English oak being is a strong timber, as we said, it's gnarlier, and it is very rot resistant. But again, European oak, French oak, German oak, it is naturally rot resistant and durable. So perfectly suitable for all those applications, as the rebuilding of Notre Dame, those roof timbers going back in there, were there for a long time, and the new ones will be there for a long time also. It's used because it's the best.
Great, thank you. Next, we have a question from Aaron. Do you want to come?
Hi, yeah, thank you guys so much. Taking my understanding of these issues from nothing at all to something in the space of an hour, so that's great. Basically, I've got projects here, there, and everywhere, and which ones will come to complete fruition is hard to say. But one thing that I'm looking at is a property development on an 1830 farmhouse here in Somerset, and I wouldn't have a ginormous budget, but I would like it to kind of stay true to form. What kind of wood would I be looking at for something that's like, not fancy house, but farmhouse?
For what elements of the house, Aaron?
Doors, probably, kitting out kitchens and bathrooms. I guess in conceiving of it, I think more of painted surfaces than I do of showing all the wood texture. So maybe this is all irrelevant. I would just use something cheap and paint it. But in places to show grain. I mean, I guess what I'm thinking is, what if I was looking at the wood in an 1830 farmhouse? What would I be looking at? Do you think?
Well, if it's a farmhouse, and Bruce, who you met the other day, who's the director or creative director of Artichoke, has recently done his house up, and a slightly earlier building, but he used elm boards, randomly selected different width elm boards with kind of rough-headed nails, very, very, very naively braced. But that would be, elm was a typical kind of rough agricultural decorative hardwood used in kind of farmhouses. Elm would be my timber of choice in that situation.
Okay.
Is it cheaper, Bob, than oak?
No. in a word. But we do a beautiful job, and absolutely right. Traditionally used in exactly that environment. Absolutely right.
Okay, great one. And then Andy's at least vaguely aware of my other project, which is something kind of like a gypsy caravan in a modern sense. with wood that's going to be outdoors a lot, possibly with a canvas cover, but still, you know, subject to the elements in the kind of raw form, and then also having torsional forces of moving at 70 miles an hour with the wind buffeting it. What does anybody have any opinions about what kind of wood would be great for that, or especially the structural gantry?
Yeah, traditionally you'd be ash.
Ash.
Yeah, I mean ash is used traditionally in sort of a lot of that sort of work, and again, you know, we still supply a lot to sort of car restoration and cart restoration, and you know, people who are steam bending ash for exactly that type of use. So it's very, very strong. Traditionally used a lot for exactly that sort of use.
Excellent. And then I plan to veneer it, to skin it really with a marine grade, sustainably sourced hardwood. I mean, just basically marine grade is the thing there. Does that seem reasonable or something better?
Why are you skinning it? Just for durability?
Well, no, to create protection from the elements. Basically, I'm going to have a run of 4 gantries for the structure of it, a 5th one for the back door, but then, you know, coming up and around the sides of it, kind of like a horse box. It needs, you know, something going between those gantries to stop the rain coming in and the wind and all that. Yeah.
I mean, you know, again, traditionally it would have just been, I mean, the protection element would have come from the coating. High spec timber coating.
High spec. So start with a standard hardboard, not marine, and coat it.
Well, I mean, it would come with a finish, with a sort of you know, again, I don't know what was used back in the day, to be honest, but I mean, I would have thought you'd want to sort of keep the natural. I don't know the project, but you know, the natural beauty of the ash, coated with a marine type finish. You know, yacht varnish type thing is often how they'd be done.
I'm just going to take one more question, if that's okay. I'm just conscious we have to now close this event because past 8. Sorry. James, do you want to ask the last question? James, sorry.
Hi, sorry, I had asked both of my questions before, but I do have another one.
I'm sorry. Sorry, did I miss? I'm just going to check that I didn't miss anyone that hasn't yet asked a question. Okay, quick one, and then I think we need to wrap up.
Thank you very much. So elm's just recently been mentioned quite a lot, and again is a beautiful flooring material used quite a lot. What size boards could you get in elm to own if it's more flexible in specification terms?
Yeah, I mean, elm boards really, typical elm logs are around the sort of, you know, 2.4 to 3.6 sort of meters, you know, 8 to 12 foot width of boards, depending, you know, elm's got natural character, depending what someone wants to include within the board. You know, you wouldn't want to go much wider than the sort of 6-inch wide in elm boards for stability.
So on that question, what's the widest board that you could get available, either in a pine or in a hardwood, to match historic floorboards at the moment?
Well, you really are, but you are back to oak if you're trying to get the thing. You are back to oak.
Okay, thanks.
All right, I'm so sorry for those who weren't able to ask questions, but could we split back to your previous slide, Andrew? Because I think you had some contact details. Everyone wants to take like a snapshot. You can.
I've got a bit of a technical issue. I can't get off this slide. But Bob's email address. What's your email address, Bob?
Well, I mean, you can either to Bob Sykes at sykestimber.co.uk or sales@sykestimber.co.uk. And again, really, absolutely anything timber question-wise, specification-wise. You know, we're not just flogging wood to people. It's very important to us for the wider picture of timber specification, and you know, using our sort of experience to sort of get to the best project. That's what we're about. So anytime, really happy to talk about anything.
Great. And Andrew, what's the best way to get in touch with you for those who don't know you already?
Andrew at Artichoke oak.co.uk.
Okay, great. Well, thank you both so much for this evening's lecture and discussion. It's been so informative for, I'm sure, most of us, if not all of us. So thank you. Big round of applause.
Thank you.
I wish you
Thank
could hear
you.
everyone's
Well done,
applause.
Thank you for having us.
Cheers and have a good evening, everyone.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay,
Bye.
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 Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent.